Okay, so speaking about high-performing organizations, I think I'll jump right into it. So what are high-performing teams, right? And typically I'll ask you a question about this, but I think let's just jump into the definition directly. It's basically a group of individuals with complementary skills who achieve outstanding results, right? It takes clear goals, mutual trust, effective communication, strong collaboration, and a focus on execution. And I always add the focus on execution because I think even when you have everything else there, if people are not focused on executing, then nothing gets done. And at the end of the day, we're all measured, rewarded, and valued and evaluated by what we get done. So I think very simply put, a high performing team is just people who get things done. And that's what we are all looking for, right? Ultimately, we want to be high performers, we want to be on high performing teams. Um, Now, you can believe me or not believe me, but I also added some research here. And I think, again, most of us here, even if we operate in a local context, we are global minded, right? We're operating in a world where you can't sit in the silo anymore. You can't be in some corner in Kenya or in some corner in India or in some corner in Nigeria. You kind of have to start to think of yourself as a global operator. And so I think some of the research on the global level is important to share. And that research by McKinsey shows that when an executive is operating in a high performing team, they're 5 times more productive than when they're working in an average team. So if you're to ask most managers today, what is their biggest problem? Yes, there's probably regulation. Yes, there's the business itself. Yes, there's customers, there's revenue, etc. But consistently, and I've spoken to probably 500 to 700 business leaders over the last few years about this topic in particular. Consistently, something you hear people tell you over and over again is my team, my team, my team. I need to improve my team's performance. I need to improve my team's productivity. I need to improve my team. And so most of our headaches as leaders comes from not having high performing teams. Now, the second part of what this says is that the case for building a dream team is very strong and the techniques are proven. This is not something that, we have to reinvent over and over again. There might be different nuances depending on the context you're in, but ultimately the formula for building high performing teams is actually kind of known. So today I'm going to be sharing with you, my own adaptation of many of the things I've learned through my career about how to build high performing teams. Now, this is why we're here today. And the objectives of the session, I think, which is really important just to set the context for what we're going to be going over. I'm going to start by saying who I am. I think it's really important for people to know why I'm here. And then Mola has tried to introduce me, and he did a fantastic job. There might be a couple of additional things I want to add there, just to give you guys context for why I'm speaking on this topic. Then I'm going to speak about principles around high-performing teams. These are things that I've developed. Now, I'm not going to go into 10 levels of detail on every single one. It's more of just sharing with you some insights I've had over my experience, right? And some things that I think are important to note along the journey of building high-performing teams. And then obviously, you here have a role in helping to build high-performing teams within your organization. And of course, lastly, we'll have a Q&A and open discussion. So with that said, who am I and why am I sitting in front of you here? By the way, the people that are still adding their names and their roles, thank you very much. It's helping me. I can kind of see, what's there as well. Okay, so who am I? This slide is really just a way for you to get a sense for what I've been up to, where I've been. So from a live perspective, I think the most important part for me is life and living, right? So I grew up in Nigeria. I spent my first sort of couple of decades there. I moved to France. I schooled there for a while. I moved to America. I schooled there for a while. I went to university there. They got tired of me. They sent me to Canada with my job. And so I went to Canada for a while. Then I got tired of being in Canada. It was way too cold in Toronto. So I ran back to the US again. And I kind of moved around the US, right? I've lived in, Boston and Chicago and New York and Atlanta and other places, San Francisco. And I got really to the point where I wanted to be home. So I booked a one-way flight. I flew back to Nigeria and I spent about 9 years in Lagos, Nigeria. I kind of traveled around Africa at the time. And then in the last sort of year and a half, my wife and I have been shuttling between Nigeria and Portugal because we're now looking to also experience other parts of the world again, right? So I think one of these big things is that all of us are fluid. We live in a world today where people are fluid. Today you're in Lagos, tomorrow you're in Nairobi, tomorrow you're in Jakarta, next day you're in Delhi. And I think throughout our careers, many of us here will live in multiple cities. I think that comes with a lot of perspective as well, right? Because you can see things in different contexts. So I'm also schooled, of course, at different places, within Nigeria. I went to Atlantic Hall, and then I went to the US, attended a few schools there, and then I'm back here again. With work, I've worked at very small companies, very large Fortune 500 companies. I've worked at small startups in Nigeria. I've worked at scaling startups in Nigeria. I've worked at very large multinationals in the US. I've worked at multinationals in Nigeria. And so I've operated in Kenya, in Ghana, in Egypt. And I think the point here is that I've seen many things that sort of are common across organizations, whether they're very large, whether they're very small. And sometimes we think of, businesses as being so different. But I think when it comes to performance, there's some very key things that you see across the board, regardless of that company's size, stage, or location. So just to bring some of this to life a little bit, I'm going to just give you a couple of anecdotes of the things that I actually did, right? So at Bain was one of the top 3 consulting firms in the world. I joined them as my first job out of university. I don't think I contributed that much value, but my first 2 weeks there, I think were really critical because it was tons of training. And I think we'll speak about the role of training, right? But I think it set the foundation for my entire career because this company has a heavy focus on training. Before we do any work, we start with training. And then along the way, at every stage of the way, we had a lot of training as well. The second thing that I think was really important at Bain was every single project you did had a detailed assessment, right? They write you a long assessment of your strengths and weaknesses. And this was accompanied with a competency framework. So you kind of understood what was expected for you at every single level. And I think for me, that allowed me to get a sense for, what skills should I even have and how should I deploy those skills? So I think very, very important. There was a very strong reward system. So if you did really well, you got really well treated. If you started to underperform, there was an up or out policy, which meant if you don't get promoted by a certain time frame, you get fired. So very, very strong sort of incentive to perform. And then, of course, lots of coaching and career development. And I think the key thing here is that it was the foundation of my career. My claim to fame at Bain was that I helped a very large company save, $500 million in wasted money. They were spending money on marketing and promotions, and they were not very effective. And I was able to help them identify that amount of money, right? And so that was my first job out of university. A few years later, I joined another company called Bristow. Now this is like many years afterwards. And Bristow was based, it's a global company, but I joined the Nigeria team. And I was based in Lagos, Nigeria. It's a 50-year-old company in Nigeria, at the time, 50-year-old company, very outdated corporate culture. I came in to build a new business. The company operated helicopters, and they were starting a new business to start an airline. And they brought me in to start the airline. So as you can imagine, a lot of people in the company were pissed. Who's this new person that has not been in this industry for 15, 20 years, coming out of nowhere, and is coming to build this new shiny project, right? So I had to slow down, understand the context. I couldn't just apply brute force to getting things done the way I've been taught in the past. I had to meet people where they were, listen to them, engage, negotiate, motivate them, right? And then also clarify goals because we had some issues, which I'll share later, around different goals coming from different leaders in the company. And I think the biggest thing again here for me was we went from a highly disengaged team, right? Like we had people who were just completely checked out, but I was able to carve out a team for myself within the organization. We're talking about pilots, cabin crew, maintenance engineers, terminal staff, people at the lounge to greet guests. And carve out that group. And by the time I left, this was probably considered a very highly motivated team. I'll share a bit more about that again in a second. And so I was able to see how you take members of a team who are just completely disengaged and move them into being highly engaged, right? And then we became a top-rated airline. So most of the customers were corporates, diplomats, HNIs, right? Flying across different cities in Nigeria. I think maybe the most important thing there as well was right now the data around on-time departures in Nigeria is about 40%, which means if you book a flight, there's a 40% chance that you actually depart on time. With Bristol, we had a 98% on-time departure, which means when you booked a flight with us, you had a 98% chance of leaving on time, which is, even in the US, even in Europe, unheard of. And so again, that's the kind of thing that you achieve when you have a high-performing team, right? And then maybe at Andela, I'll share a bit more about that as well. So I joined Andela in 2016. The company was 2 years old. And I joined at a time when they were going through a morale crisis. The typical startup challenges, you've scaled very fast, and then people are beginning to disconnect from the mission. Things are changing, policies are changing. You have employees who are feeling kind of disengaged. So I went in there and helped to convert this team from a low morale team, which had very low trust in leadership, into a very, very high performing team. We started by, understanding people, spending a lot of time understanding them, and then we moved into focusing on performance, coaching, training. The business grew about 6x during my time there, over 600%, in that 2 years to 4 year period. We got awarded the best place to work in Nigeria. We were ranked top 8 best places to work in Kenya. And then if I look at the team members that worked within my organization today, most of them have gone on to do amazing things, right? And so you could really see this high performing culture build. I also saw the company when it again it entered another period of sort of challenging performance, right? And I could, I stay close to the company. I'm on the investor calls quarterly, so you can kind of see how the company goes through the ebbs and flows and how these principles apply there as well. And lastly, I'm currently at TaskTack. And I think what TaskTack basically is, it's still very early stage. So I'm not going to speak about as much about the high performing culture right now because it's to be seen, right? All these things I'm saying as theory, we'll see how they come into life at this new company I'm at. But the reason why we built TaskTack is because during my time at all these companies I just described, I realized that this talent problem was a huge challenge. Professionals want to get better. In some cases, they're not sure how to. Leaders want their teams to improve. In some cases, they're not sure how to make that happen. And so TaskTack is really trying to become the best partner to companies by building software and tools that enable you to build high-performing teams. So think of it as like, we have learning content taught by professionals who are in the job. So you basically can take a course in sales or marketing or leadership through our platform. We have, close to 200 courses at the moment. We're going to have 500 later this year. And so you can do that on our platform. You can also do performance reviews. So you can set goals for people, write performance reviews for people, and then connect learning and performance together. And so the goal is to have all the tools that companies need to really better manage their people, give them the right feedback, support them, and enable them to grow. On the flip side, help employees get clarity about where they are, how they're performing, and how to add value to the company. So we'll talk more about TaskTack later, but just to give you guys an idea of me trying to bring a lot of these high-performing principles together into a platform that enables companies to succeed. So I'll pause there for a second to give people a chance to take a breath and sort of align with where we are, and then we'll keep going. So I think at the end of the day, what this boiled down to was I developed 8 principles, like I said earlier, that cut across company size, stage, and location. And I'm gonna go pretty fast because again, it's a lot of content. But I think I'm gonna focus on some highlights of just again things where it's like these were not necessarily so obvious to me in the past. And I think they became very obvious to me during my time sort of building these teams and working within these teams. So here are the 8 principles. To me, if you can get these 8 things right, now the difficulty in getting these 8 things right is very high. In fact, it's almost impossible to get them all perfectly well. But if you can try to move the needle as far as possible on each of these 8, you significantly increase the chances of your team becoming a high-performing team. So the first thing is purpose. Some people call that vision. Some people call that mission. Um, what this is basically, okay, actually, you know what? I'll go through that in a second. Then we have the strategy and the business model. Then we have the org-wide individual goals, right? The goals for people on the team. Then we have the design of the team itself. Then you have people management. You have performance management, which are 2 different things. They're fairly related, but different. And then you have values and culture, which is, again, we'll get through it. And then lastly, the operating cadence. So these are the 8 things that I've seen in my experience. That's, when I was COO at Bellhop in the US, when I was VP of operations at Andela across Africa, when I served as, head of strategy for the new business at Bristol, these things are consistent across the board. So let's jump into it. So we'll go to purpose. Again, focusing on some of the key insights. I think the main thing around purpose is that our job is to help people understand and connect to the company's purpose. So I'll give 2 examples of ways in which I did that, just to kind of bring this point to life. So we had cleaners at Andela. We had an office, we had a huge office, and we had cleaners in the office. And we would basically tell the cleaners that their job was to make the office so conducive to everyone that the engineers at the company could do their best work and serve our customers. So Andela's business was we had engineers working with global companies. And these companies are people that have typically never worked with Africans. So we had to explain to everyone in the company how their role sort of drove that company's mission. So even as a cleaner, you woke up every day and you thought to yourself, as I do my job, I'm enabling the company to succeed. And I can see a very direct line between my job and the company's success. And we could see that even as low, when people consider cleaners to be low-level employee, you could see the very deep connection and very deep commitment to the company's mission. Then you go back to Bristol, right? And we have people at the terminal. So these are folks that check you in, take your bags, you get on the plane. And my sort of communication to them consistently was that their job, again, is very connected to the company's mission. So the way people experience at our terminals, if that experience is so pleasant, then when you travel, you feel even more energized, right? Because you've woken up, you've come to the airport, you've gotten on a flight, and so you feel so energized that you can actually go about your day. And so they felt like their job was to make people feel so comfortable that they could get on with their day when they arrived. I don't know how many of you here travel for work, but when you arrive where you're going, the first thing that happens, you're very tired. And so to even start your day, you're like exhausted already. So what we did is we created a system where, because our flights are on time, because the terminal staff were so polite, so friendly, so engaging, by the time you got to where you're going, you didn't feel drained. You felt energized. And again, we saw that kind of come to light with the on-time departures. We actually had a few ambassadors write us letters unsolicited saying this is the best airline they've flown across the continent. So again, understanding the context, understanding the mission, and being able to connect is a really key part of building a high-performing team. And our jobs are to understand them ourselves, but also help others connect to that. And I think the key question here, which we don't have to answer today, but just as food for thoughts, is if you go back to your organization, do people understand the mission? And can they connect to it? Can they draw a very straight line between what they do and the company's mission? And if the answer is yes, then I think you're on track. If the answer is no, then there's some work to be done there. So very simply on purpose and mission, I think that's what it is. Going to strategy and business model. The key thing that I've noticed here is that a lot of employees are silent skeptics. So the company creates a strategy, they have a model, they go out there and they're excited about it. They say, this year we're gonna, do all these amazing things. And a lot of employees in the company are thinking, yeah, sure, I don't know if I believe in this company's, sort of direction. And so PwC did a survey, and that survey found out that most executives, and this was a global survey, so not just, someone in America or somebody in the UK, is like kind of global. Most executives said they did not feel their company strategy would lead to success. And less than half of them said that the company is clear about how it added value to customers. Think about that for a second. So these are people that are sitting in executive positions and they're saying that they're not sure the company's strategy actually makes sense. They're also not sure if the company is actually clearly adding value to customers and just cascade down across the rest of the organization. And how can a company like that actually be successful? How can you build high-performing teams when people do not even feel like the strategy makes any sense? So again, at the top level, I think some people here might be senior leaders in the company. Some of you might be advisors to senior leaders, and some of you might be in HR. We'll talk about how you can play a role in helping to sort of articulate the strategy of the company and allowing people to feel more connected to it. I'll bring the point home with some examples from my experience. So on the left side, these devices, if you've never seen them, then I'm not surprised. These are called Palm devices. So there's a company called Palm. It was founded by some guy called John Rubinstein. And a few years ago, when I was at HP decided to buy Palm. So the entire discussion was we need to have a much more clear mobile strategy. We need to compete against Apple and Samsung and Google with Android. And we need to have and HP was at the time the largest tech company in the world, $300 billion in revenue and 192 countries covered. And the question was, let's go buy somebody, right? So I remember us having this very long discussion about this in a strategy meeting. And I was a bit more junior at the time. So I went and did my research, right? I literally went out and went to a bunch of different stores and asked them, I want to buy a phone. What do you recommend? And as soon as I brought up this device, they'll be like, don't buy that device. It sucks. So I put together a very, very strong presentation saying, Apple and Google had reached the tipping point where it was very hard for somebody else to come and compete with them. And I shared that with my senior leadership. But basically, the CEO said, we're going to buy Apple. We're going to buy this company anyway. Now, I remember in that meeting, I was looking around the room, and there were a few executives who didn't seem like they agreed, but they couldn't speak up. And so what ended up happening was HP went ahead and bought Palm, spent $1.2 billion in that acquisition. And then within 3 years, they had written the entire thing off to zero. And in my mind, I was thinking, if they gave me that money, I could probably have done a couple of, nice things with that money, right? So literally bought a company. 3 years later, the entire asset was written off to zero. And so that's one example of where people don't believe in the strategy, but they don't feel confident speaking about it. And as you can kind of see the impact of that on being able to build a team that's considered high performance. On the right side, at Bristol, when I first joined and tried to build this airline, there were two leaders that were involved. And one of them had a point of view on, we need to build a very low cost airline. We need to compete on price. We need to be the best priced airline in the country. We need to basically, provide people with cheap tickets and they can get to the destination. The other person thought we need to be super premium, almost luxury even. And we need to be higher priced. We need to be really excellent on service and experience. And these two things were conflicting. And so the question becomes, based on the price of it, of even the tickets, that impacts how much you can invest in things like the lounge, how much you can invest in things like the food on the plane. And so I found myself sort of caught between these two different strategic point of views. And it was very demotivating for me. So eventually I had to get them into a room. I basically set up a meeting with two of them in the same room, but they had two different meeting invites. And they came to the room and they said, "Oh, what's the guy doing here?" And I said, "Okay, you're both here for a meeting because you need to clarify to me what the strategy is." And so in that situation, neither of them had actually discussed with each other. So again, you can see how at times leadership, we have different things that we want to achieve. We send that message down to the teams, and then people are doing different things and they're very confused. Ultimately, we're able to align on a specific strategy and then execute, right? But I think the goal here is that within a lot of organizations, that strategy is unclear, even to the senior
Yeah.
leaders. And so again, the same question, because each of these, the question is pretty much the same, right? If you look at your organization and even just look at yourself, do you understand the strategy of your company and do you believe in it? And again, if the answer is yes, that's great. If the answer is a no, then this is one more thing that's probably preventing you or your team members from achieving high performance. So we'll move on into goals now and talk about this a bit more. Some of the insights here, because I think goals are things that we all talk about. So there's nothing probably new around that in terms of, okay, let's set goals. Let's make sure the goals are, smart goals. We talk about smart goals all the time. But I think some of my own experiences are in a lot of companies, we have a lack of goal clarity. So we think we've set goals, but for each individual, there's still a lot of ambiguity in those goals. And I think, again, this is where HR professionals, L&D professionals, senior managers can come in is, um, are you able to support people in getting more goal clarity? Are you able to support the organization in creating more goal clarity? So I'll go back to the Bristol example, right? When I was struggling with the strategy and the goals, because when the strategy was confusing, it then created lack of goal clarity for me. For example, how many seats do I need to sell to break even? If the seats are priced at, a low price, very different number of seats than if they're high priced. How hard do I need to work? Because again, based on pricing and based on the service level we're delivering, do I need to go after 10,000 customers to be successful, or do I need to go after 100 customers to be successful? And so how does that impact how much work I need to put in that effort? Do I have the right resources? And then lastly, how do I even know I'm doing well? So without clear goals, these are the kinds of questions employees begin to ask themselves, and it can become very demotivating, and you can then see that affect performance. There's some other goals that we set that don't have a clear impact. So I use some cartoons every now and then just to kind of make it a bit lighter. But this situation, the person says, I need to do an inventory in our warehouses. It should take about a month. And then the person's manager asks them, hypothetically, would anyone know the difference if you just made up the numbers? And it says, well, no. And they say, okay, that's a dream job. So many people find themselves in jobs where they're doing things that literally have zero clear impact. If you just make it up and share some number, nobody will actually know that you did the work or didn't do the work. And when you think about, again, goals that drive value for the company, if you don't have everybody on the team working on things that are clearly impactful, then it's very hard to drive performance, right? And so I've seen this over and over and over again. I've been guilty of doing this as well and having to catch myself. But I think that's something that all of us need to be aware of. Another one is goals that are unbalanced. So one thing people say about goals is, you set really aggressive goals or really, ambitious goals. But I think there's a counterpoint to that, which is sometimes your goals have to complement each other, right? So I'll give you an example again to bring it to life. This person is a tech support person. It says, "Hello, this is tech support. May I close your ticket?" And the customer says, "No, you haven't helped me yet. I just called you." Then he says, "I'm not evaluated on how helpful I am to you. I'm evaluated on how many tickets I close." Because we set a KPI that says, number of tickets closed. So then the customer is upset, and the customer is now thinking about their own KPIs. It says your stubbornness is becoming an obstacle to my own financial success, right? And anyway, just to kind of cut the point short, The customer service person says, by the way, if our call gets disconnected, I can count it as a closed ticket. So again, this is you incenting people on one metric, which is a very important metric. But typically, you should probably add another metric that's called customer satisfaction here, right? And I've seen many organizations where we set the metric on, solving a problem, but we don't solve the metric on how satisfied is the person you solve the problem for. So there's a whole category of goals that aren't balanced. So I'll kind of wrap it up with just some best practices I've seen on goal setting, right? The goal is to avoid having too many goals and instead applying this Pareto principle of 80-20. Typically about 80% of your value is captured with 20% of the effort. So rather than setting 10, 20 goals and people are not even sure how to achieve them, focus on 3 to 5 top level goals. Make sure those goals are balanced. Make sure those goals are clear. Make sure those goals are actually impactful. And then people can actually go out and achieve them. The second thing is around goals that are not ambitious enough. I think once you look at your goals and you say, oh, okay, I can do this easily, then it sort of like makes you step back from putting in a lot of effort. And so instead, the goal here is to stretch people, but be somewhat realistic. The third thing I've seen is people that are too ambitious based on history, right? Too ambiguous. I'm sorry, too ambiguous based on history. So you kind of look back and say, okay, we achieved these things last year, so let's try and achieve these other things this year. But it's not very clear on how you get there. And so the goal is to remove the ambiguity in the outcomes and make it very clear to people. I talked about leaders that are not goal aligned in the past, right? Where, you have senior leaders in the company has set the goals and they're thinking, I'm not even sure we're going to achieve this goal, but yeah, sure, I'll say yes. And what we need to do is get commitment from leadership. That even if they're not 100% sure they get to those goals, they agree on those goals. And if they don't agree to those goals, then it's probably worth a conversation to revise them. Then going below that executive level, make sure the goals are clear and cascading them beyond that level. Ensuring you can easily track goals. The goals have been set many times where it's impossible to track them, right? I've had people on my team, even at Tastak, say, oh, let's put this as a goal. And I'm like, okay, what are we actually going to use to track? Like at the end of the quarter, where's the information that would tell us whether or not we did well on that goal? And if that's impossible to do, then you can't track it. And there's no point actually setting that as a goal. And then lastly is a lot of times we're moving so fast, we have so much to do that we don't have time to learn and reflect. And so my advice there typically, and what I've done in the past is created periodic reviews to learn. And this is literally a moment where you can stop and tell people, okay, we're going to spend 3 hours or 2 hours looking at the previous quarter. What did we do? What did we achieve? What went well? What didn't go well? What have we learned from that? And then how can we apply that in the future, right? And so this is a ritual that I think is an important part of goal setting. I'll pause again just so we can digest some of this because it's a lot of content. So now we'll move into org design. With org design, again, in the spirit of keeping this focused on sort of key insights, there's some things that you guys probably have seen in your careers, right? Things like people saying, I have an employee located in a particular city. So maybe I'm the head of the Kenya office or the Nigeria office for a company. But there's also a marketing lead for the company. There's an employee that sits in the country I lead. And that person seems to be having an issue and we need to decide whether we want to fire them. Who makes that call? Is that person on the marketing team but sits in my country? Is it me as a country leader? Or is it the head of marketing? And that actually impacts execution. Who decides new product features? Is it tech or is it sales? So sales is going to the customers, speaking to customers. Tech is the one that actually builds the product. Who decides new product features? Is it sales team or is it the tech team? You see that again. Who owns the model for the company? Is it finance or operations, right? Finance is looking at the numbers and cranking the numbers. Operations is executing. Who owns the actual model? And then, for example, who determines pricing? Again, is it sales or is it finance? So the customers say they want a discount. Does the sales team have autonomy to give them a discount? Or does the finance team have to approve that discount? When you have these type of situations, they impact execution, right? And so with org design, the big focus there is, can we design decision-making in a way that allows us to be effective in driving the value? What I've seen a lot of times is that a lot of conflicts we face are driven from design issues. They're not personality issues. They're not, people trying to be, combative. It's just that we've designed things incorrectly. So you see questions like, why wasn't I in that meeting? Or because nobody knew you should have been there. So maybe you thought it was your responsibility. People didn't think it was yours. You were invited. How come no one informed me? Because it wasn't very clear that you needed to know what was going on. When did this happen? This is not your domain. You have someone tell you this is not your domain. This is my domain. And then you see people say, my manager doesn't have my time because our manager, their role design has made them so stressed that they don't have time for their team members. So when I start to see things like this, I actually think of them as design problems. And one of the most important tools that I think we can use to solve design problems is the org chart, right? Because the org chart kind of shows you who reports to who, what are the lines. But an org chart is incomplete because there are many things that cut across organizations. And so a tool that is really helpful is a decision matrix. I've given an example of one on the slide here, but you don't need to use this. There are many different things you can use for this. But essentially, what a decision matrix allows you to do is it says, for some very, very big, important decisions, for example, the one on who can fire somebody, is it the country manager or is it the functional lead or who can make pricing decisions? I think even with HR, right? Does the manager need HR approval to let go of an employee? Or can the manager let go of the employee and just inform HR? I think we see that one a lot, right? Um, you can just say for these, few big decisions that we consistently make across the company, let's make a RACI chart. Let's make a decision matrix around who makes that decision, who needs to be informed, who's accountable for it. And what that lets you do is, as people come across those decisions, they have a much better sense of how to ensure that they are communicating with the right people and engaging the right people. And that's really the biggest thing I've seen with design in most cases. It impacts how you make decisions, who gets involved, who gets informed, and who feels empowered to be part of getting to solutions. So a few things to look out for when you start to have design issues. Sometimes they don't look like design issues, but they are design issues. When you have people that are top performance and then they begin to struggle, there might be a design issue. I faced this myself once, and the issue I had was basically I'd been placed in charge of 20 teams. And I was feeling ambitious with myself, let me take on more responsibility, let me, improve my scope. But what was happening was I was getting super stretched. And eventually I was unable to actually deliver on some of the areas of my job. And so people, even started asking me like, hey, it looks like you're struggling a little bit. So when you see top performers struggling, there might be a design problem there. When you have people with responsibility, but no authority, there's a big design problem there. So you're told you are responsible for this happening, but you actually don't have the authority to influence that outcome. And that happens a lot. Another issue I've seen over and over again is people that have, again, too many direct reports. I think it ties to top performers who are struggling. It could be a symptom of that. But people that have too many direct reports usually don't have time for them. And so that's an area where we probably have wrong design. I think the general principle there is you probably don't want to have someone with more than 7 direct reports, right? Between 3 to 7 is probably the right number, unless they're like very, very senior executives who have very, very senior people reporting to them, in which case, you need less supervision. And I think the last one is when a particular conflict keeps recurring over and over and over again, is a very, very good sign, and probably a design issue. And one of the most often seen design issues there with issues that keep coming up over and over again is that one particular team has been told that they're responsible for something, and another team has been given that same responsibility or strong influence over that thing. And that typically causes design issues there. Right? So I'll pause once for a second and then we'll go into people management. We're about halfway through now, so I think we're in the home stretch. On people management, there are a few key things there. The first is recruiting. I think many of us get so busy that we don't actually take recruiting as a really, really important part of managing our people. Because managing people starts all the way from recruiting, even before they join the company. And so my thing is you treat recruiting as a step in the onboarding process. That means include a values and cultural screening. We typically focus just on performance and can they do the job. A lot of organizations don't focus enough on values and screening. In fact, when I interviewed with Bain, I remember I had 4 interviews. This is my first job, so I was very confused by the fact that we had 4 interviews. But the last interview, when I walked into the room, I came prepared to answer tons of technical questions, maybe analysis. And the person just started asking me about myself, my values, what I believe in. what I care about, my aspirations. And I realized later on that that's because that person's job was to explicitly determine whether or not I could fit into the company's values and culture system, right? So when I've forgotten this step along the way, when I've diminished this step along the way, in most cases, it's beating me later on because the person is probably not a values or culture fit. Include other team members and key collaborators. Um, Most people that join a company are not working by themselves. And even in the department they're working in, they're probably not working only in that department. So something that's really helpful is to have one or two people. It doesn't have to be a bunch of people, just even one or two people from either other departments that they're collaborating with, or people that are in other parts of the team that maybe are not part of the core hiring group to also interview them or to show up to maybe the session where they have to present their case studies or whatever it is you're giving them during the interview. And what that does is it allows people that have fresh eyes to kind of look at these candidates and see them with a different perspective. But also means that the candidates should get the job, they now have some supporters elsewhere in the company, even beyond their core team. And the last thing I would say is giving candidates real work. So I've gotten some pushback on this, right? You have a candidate and you say, hey, I want to give you this thing to do. And they tell you that, oh, your company is going to use my work to advance the company's interest. Or maybe it's a real project the company needs to do and you're using me for free labor. When people do that, I typically shy away from talking to them further because I'm like, if you think this one interview question or this one case study is what's going to make or break the entire company, then like maybe you don't understand how companies work. But I think it's really important. I'll give you an example. At some point at Andela, we had to move to a new office. We had a very tight timeline. It was highly stressful, and you know, we ended up doing something, and it worked out fine. But at the time, it wasn't very clear if it was going to work out. So what I started doing is whenever we had a candidate for our operations role, I would give them the exact context and say, what would you do in this situation? Because now I have all the information. So I can give them as much information as they need. And I can say, okay, how would you decide on these three different options that we're considering? And then see how they actually methodically analyze those decisions and come up with an answer. And in most cases, it gives me a really clear insight into how the person thinks, rather than just giving them some fictitious scenario. So I think those are some of my insights on the recruiting process. On candidate experience, which is sort of part of the recruiting process as well. You reach out to me as a candidate. You say, hey, I'm interested in you, because your profile looks good. And then you pass me on to a hiring manager. So usually HR reaches out to the person, right? In many cases. Then you pass me on to a hiring manager. And the hiring manager gets in a meeting with me and starts asking me, why do I want to work at the company? I'm like, I don't know anything about you guys. Someone reached out to me and invited me. So the first step is always provide the candidates a lot of context about the role and the company, equip them with the information they need to understand what the job is about, what the company is about, before you start asking them questions. Then also clarify the process. Is it 3 steps? Is it 5 steps? Is it 10 steps? So they can kind of plan. Because again, when you're interviewing people, they probably have other things going on, and it's good for them to have an expectation of what to see. But it also tells them that the company is serious and the company has structure and the company has a process, right? The hiring manager should be involved all the way through the offer. An example here was I was once interviewing with a company that I interned with them and I was going to go back and join them full time. I had worked with the CEO. We got along really well. I was very motivated and inspired. Then we started negotiating the offer. At some point in the discussion, he said, why don't you speak to HR? Because HR decides salaries. Then he removed himself from the email thread. As I started going back and forth with HR, the way that HR person was engaging with me, I just became so uninterested in the company because I'm like, and then I copied him into the email so you can see it. He never responded. So at some point, I was like, look, if this is how you guys treat people, maybe because I was lucky because I've been dealing with the CEO directly. But if this is how the HR team treats people, then of course, when I start working at the company, that's how I'm going to be treated. Because I was interning at first with the CEO. Now I'm going to be part of an employee full time. So I've said, actually, I don't think I want to work here anymore. And I didn't take the offer and I left and went to do something else, right? Or I didn't leave. I moved on to something else. Um, and I think I've had people tell me about that experience as well. You're having this really great conversation with this hiring manager. Somewhere along the way, they move you into the HR team. HR team has not been given context for anything. They didn't tell the HR leader that, oh, this person is a superstar. We really want that person. And so treat them, as best as you can. They just hand them over. And then the discussion just deteriorates. Another thing I see during this process is that the hiring manager makes certain promises to the candidates during the interview process. By the time the candidate gets to the end, and they're asking some of those questions, the person they're talking to doesn't know any of that context, and they're like, no, we don't do that. So that's why I think it's really, really important for that hiring manager to be involved all the way through the process, all the way to the offer. One other thing I'll just say as a final point on this hiring manager involvement is, I don't know if you guys have ever been interviewing with a company where discussion is really great and friendly and it's just positive vibes. And then you get the offer letter by email, no phone call, and it's just like you are required to sign this offer within 30 days, and here's intellectual property clause, and it's just like, whoa, this is a different vibe. So it's important for you to call the person before you send the offer and say, hey, I'm sending you the offer. It's a formal document, so there are going to be some clauses there that sound very formal, but really, we want to bring you on board. And so that way the person can feel that love all the way through the process, right? And then lastly, maintain communication. Don't ghost. I don't know if anybody in this room has experienced that. I've experienced it before, where you're interviewing the company and they just ghost on you, and it's I think the way this kind of comes out into the high performance teams is that in many cases, you lose some really good candidates. That's one. But secondly, if you have a reputation for this, then it impacts who actually applies to the company, who's interested in the company. And as part of building a high performance team, you want to get the best candidates in the door, right? And so being able to give really good candidate experience, people will speak about your company, right? When I was at Adela, people would speak about our interview process. People that I met later in the future who I didn't hire would tell me that, hey, look, yeah, I still have beef with you, but like I have to be honest, you guys have had a great interview process, and like it was very professional. I respect that, and they will tell other people about you. New hire onboarding, super critical, something that we don't take seriously many times. I messed this up last year. So, by the way, I'm the one teaching this course, but even I got this wrong last year. We hired somebody, we were so busy, and we did a terrible job of onboarding them, and the person didn't last more than 6 months in the company. It is real. We have to start by once somebody has joined the company, they need to kind of just get reacquainted with the company's purpose, the strategy of the company, the goals of the company. What are you trying to achieve as a company? This could be coming from the senior leader, the CEO, somebody at the executive level, or it could be from their manager. But it's really critical for them because they've come from somewhere else with different goals and different missions and different strategy and different purpose. And now you're reorienting them. So they need to, very early in their journey, kind of get reoriented. Then they also need to get reoriented on the values of the company. Because again, what they did in their previous company might be a little bit different from what they're doing at your company. So what's the values here? What's the culture here? What are the expectations here? Yes, we discussed it during the interview process, but let's not lie to ourselves. During the interview, people just want to get the job. So they might not be listening to everything as clearly. Now that they're here, we need to again just take one more chance to reorient them to our company's operating principles. And then setting very clear goals for them in those first 90 days so that they're off to a great start and it's very clear to them, my first 90 days, this is what I need to achieve. Um, I think another area where a lot of people get it wrong is, we don't expose them to as much of the team as possible. I think this serves two purposes. The first one is by exposing them to more people on the team, we're just helping them to accelerate their learning curve, right? They can learn faster and get up to speed faster. But the second thing is this, right? For all of us to be successful in the company, we need supporters. And when I join a company and people can say, oh, I met this person, oh, he's a great guy, or she's a great, woman, and I actually I want to help this person succeed. That accelerates your chance of succeeding. So by exposing them to more people, just having them have one-on-ones with other people, even if it's 30 minutes or 15 minutes, even if it's over lunch, even if it's over Zoom or wherever it is, just more people on the team know who they are and are interested in supporting them. And then those people can think about them when there's information that they think, that might be useful to them. So really, really important. When I have people join my teams, I now give them a 2-week grace period. I don't need you to do any work or deliver any outputs. Go and immerse yourself in the company in those first couple of weeks because the payoff of you understanding the company before you start doing things is really high. And the risk of you just jumping into work right away and then you start stepping on toes, you start causing a lot of conflicts because you don't know what you're supposed to do, or you're doing things very differently from how we're meant to do them. That risk is so high. And so a lot of leaders say, you hire somebody week one, what are they delivering? I think that's a wrong practice. And I think typically you want to give people 1 or 2 weeks to integrate first before they start creating output. So again, I've seen this over and over again at different companies, and I've also done them wrong sometimes, right? And I've done them right, and I can see the difference between doing them right and doing them wrong. So we'll move on into this element of understanding what your people want. This is now employees, right? We talked about recruiting, candidate experience, onboarding. Now this is really about when people join the company. Um, Across every company I've been at, I took a lot of time and I've spoken to friends, I've advised people, I've coached managers, coached leaders. I've seen the same things over and over again that people want. And it's the same things. Now, they might want them in different proportions. Some people might lean more towards one thing or the other. So your job is to really understand what your people want. But these things people want, they're actually finite. It's clear responsibilities and goals. It's having meaningful work and some pride in what they do. It's stability and job security, that they're not going to get fired tomorrow morning, or that the company's not going to tell them the next day that they can't afford to pay them salaries anymore. It's growth and development. A lot of us here are L&D people, right? It's like I want to be able to see that I'm growing and I'm developing and I'm learning new skills. It's feeling that your employer cares about you. You're not just a number in some corner somewhere. Because when people feel that way, they start to treat the company as just, a number as well. It's great work relationships. I've seen people that really, really hate their job, but they stay there because they have people that they trust at work, or they feel like they're connected to their colleagues, and they built a community at work. And then lastly, fair compensation and benefits. And I put fair, not great, because many of us here, we've probably left jobs that paid us well to take a job that pays us less because we hated that place we used to work at, right? And so at the end of the day, we all think we're looking for money, but sometimes you get that money and you hate the place you work at and you don't last very long there. So I think it's more about being fair. When people can say, you know what, actually, yeah, the company seems to be taking care of me. Like they're not giving me the most they can possibly give me, but it feels fair. This is what people want. And so being able to understand what people want, I think allows you to then pull the right levers to motivate them, engage them, and keep them mentally prepared to get the job done. I tend to use employee surveys and one-on-ones. I know right nowadays there's a lot of debate about whether one-on-ones are effective. If you're operating in Africa, you don't have the luxury of behaving like those guys in Silicon Valley that say, oh, we don't do one-on-ones. Um, they have their reasons for not doing one-on-ones. I've worked in those markets, and there's some good reasons why some companies don't do it. In my experience in Africa, you need one-on-ones because most employees have, yes, they have things happening at work, but they also have things happening at home, in their personal lives, in their brain. There's a lot of cultural things as well. And so employee surveys allow you to measure in aggregate how people feel about the company, and you can ask very detailed questions. One-on-ones allow you to kind of just get a really good pulse of what's happening in the company from individuals. And so if you're the HR, if you're a manager, I think this is a really strong tool for you. So now we're going to move into performance management. I won't talk much about individual performance because I think that a lot of what we said earlier is tied to that. But essentially, there's a bit of a formula that you can kind of engineer. It's, do I have people with the right skills? So whether I've hired the people with the right skills or I'm using L&D to improve their skills, are they motivated? On the previous slide right now, we talked about some of the levers that motivate people, and we talked about all the other elements of that in the previous section. Are there clear goals that they can hit? And then are they accountable for hitting those goals? Typically, when you can engineer this formula, you kind of get individual performance, right? So we spend a lot of our time talking about positive performance, but I think it's also important to speak about issues and how we can get really good at diagnosing issues. And I've typically seen four types of issues. It's either a knowledge issue, in which case the person just doesn't know. So then you want to realign that person on the strategy, the goals, the expectations of them. Or it's a design issue where the person has been put in charge of something that they actually are not responsible for, or they have too many people on their team, so they can't actually manage the teams well, things like that. In which case, you want to visit the role design or the org design. Or it's a skill issue where the person just doesn't have the right skill set to get the job done. In which case, the question is, can they learn from you? Can they learn from someone else? Or can they learn on your own? This is where L&D kicks in. And I think the skill issue is a big one, particularly in Africa markets. Or it's a motivation issue. A motivation issue simply means that person is waking up and they're just not motivated to do the work. It could be things happening in their personal life, it can be things happening professionally. And so the question there is like, are you providing a good enough employee value proposition? And are you engaging your people enough that they can actually drive the value that you want from them, right? And so a big part of our jobs, whether you're the actual manager or you're just an HR or somewhere else, is really just being able to get good at diagnosing people issues because they're going to see people issues all the time, and that would impact performance. One thing I've learned is that it means to reframe firing. Before I used to feel really just a lot of anxiety around firing people. Um, I've gotten really good at this. And what I've learned from this is when you fire somebody who's chronically underperforming, you're actually being kind to them. You're being kind to them, You're being kind to yourself. You're being kind to the team. You're being kind to the company. And I'll give you just one example of this. I once had to let a team member go, and I was feeling very nervous about that. So I took the rest of the team to dinner, and I was feeling like they're going to just insult me the entire time. And I asked them a very simple question. I said, how many of you are really upset with me for letting this person go? And they were looking around the room very confused. And eventually, someone said, you should be asking us how many of us are upset with you for letting them stay for this long. And it was a huge eye opener for me that day. Um, because each person that's underperforming chronically is affecting the rest of the team. But also they know and they're in pain. And there's probably another job out there that they can be good at. So let them go find that job. Let them go do a great job elsewhere. So that's my new view, and I think it really allows you to reframe it. And when it comes to, people that are toxic or like underperforming, when you do let them go, you're probably already months late. So at the point in which you're like, this person needs to go, you're probably like a few months late already because you've probably been thinking about it for a while. And the longer you wait, the more harm that person is able to do in the company. But at the same time, we got to let people go with dignity. When we hire people, we're celebrating them, we're excited, we think we've brought the best person on board. When we let them go, it's very shameful, you put them through the back door, kick them out, in shame. I think that's not fair. So typically, they shouldn't be surprised because you have been giving them feedback. You've helped them understand how you arrive at the decision. And you've also made peace with that decision. So you're not making excuses, you're not shifting blame, you're telling them directly this is why you're being let go. And you're giving them a chance to respond to you, to see how they feel. Doesn't mean you have to engage and reply. Um, and then you don't get into an argument or debate with them during that conversation because you've decided. So I think these are things that are really important. And if you speak to people that have been let go, there's a huge difference in how they feel about the company based on the way they were treated in that process. So lastly, when it comes to like more of the goal setting, core operational sense, values and culture. This is section I'll probably keep it a little shorter because I think many of us here are probably familiar, but there are a few things I've seen from my experience, even at companies that claim to be really good. Culture is strategy for breakfast. The way people behave will determine the company's culture. And no matter what you write on paper, how people actually behave is what's essentially the company strategy is. Culture is influenced more by words and actions. So just a few random things that we probably should be looking out for. Who do you hire, especially at the senior levels? Communicate a lot more about your culture than anything you say. Who do you promote? Who do you reward? Who do you fire? What quality of work do you accept? How do you respond to missed goals and deadlines? How do you handle people that are underperforming chronically? How do you embrace or navigate disagreement within people on your team? How do you communicate bad news? Which employee complaints do you ignore? Which ones do you address? And then how do you respond to customer issues? These are the types of things that we don't think of as being the drivers of culture, and they are the drivers of culture. What I've seen culture do in terms of the behaviors is that it impacts trust, commitment, and collaboration. And again, if a high-performing team requires people who trust each other, who collaborate effectively to get things done, then the culture impacts how this happens and how well you can build a high-performing team. So don't preach meritocracy when you only reward people that are loyal to the executive team. We've probably seen that, many of us. Don't preach integrity and then you massage bad news to look good. People know that this thing is bad news, but then you try and spin it, and it's so obvious that you're spinning it that they can't trust you. You say customer obsession, but then you get feedback from a customer that's unfavorable, and you say those people they're nonsense customers, or they don't know what they're talking about, right? You don't take it seriously. Then people within the company are not going to feel customer obsessed. People pretend to have tons of diversity in their company and say, oh, we really focus on gender diversity, we want equality. But then I've been in rooms where you have people making sexist jokes, or they condone harassment, even worse, right? And then lastly, this is a real example of someone I know was telling me a story about how, one of the senior executives in the company had been preaching financial prudence. People should be more cost conscious, save the company money. This is you're trying to get to profitability. And then the executive team went on an evening out and spent more money than they could possibly imagine. And because the person is on the finance team, they actually saw the invoices and how much was spent. And it was completely demotivating for them because they had been scraping costs. People will come to them and say, I want to purchase this equipment, or, want to invest in this particular thing. And they'll say, no, we can't do it. And then in one night, senior executives have spent more money than they could possibly imagine. And I think it just felt like that was inconsistent with the company's value. So again, these are little things that we do sometimes without realizing it. And so I think the golden rule for high performing teams when it comes to culture is quite simple. Practice what you preach. There's no right and there's no wrong, right? People join the military, and in that place, the culture is top down. And people join non-profits, maybe some of them are like very bottom up. There's no right or wrong. It's just that you have to practice what you preach. Otherwise, people will think that it's a distrustful organization, and then it begins to impact how they work together, collaborate, and deliver value. And lastly, we'll get to operating cadence. This is the end. Operating cadence is something that I would say is really critical to companies and is highly underrated. If we think about all of us that go to buy things at supermarkets, right, or we use internet, there's stability that's required for these things to work. For you to go to the supermarket every day and find water on the shelf, there's a system that needs to work. Similarly, when you're serving customers, there needs to be a system that works. So we are trying to actually get business to a point where it's a bit more predictable. I know some of us, we love being exciting and unpredictable and spontaneous, but with business, you're trying to actually get to a point where things are very predictable. And so creating an operating cadence allows you to begin to build more predictability. So essentially the way to do this is you kind of put key dates on the calendar, your quarterly reviews, your weekly team meetings. Those are things that are on the calendar. Create standardized formats for the reporting, things that you do on an ongoing basis. Try to run effective meetings. That's like a very vague statement. And then review your operating cadence periodically. Does it make sense the way we actually operate in the business? Are we doing once a month team reviews? Are we doing quarterly meetings? Things like that. The operating cadence element is we could be very detailed, so I'm keeping it very high level here. But I think the key point is for you to think about what's the company's operating cadence? What do you do weekly? What do you do monthly? What do you do quarterly? Is that very clear? And have you codified it? And is it in the calendar? So people can plan towards those events. And so what's your role as HR or L&D and all of this, right? So because again, many people here are talent specialists, HR, L&D. I think my view is that L&D typically focuses strictly on just training. And HR people typically focus on, or they come across in many cases as being more operational. But your impact can be much broader, much clearer, and much more strategic. In 2016, 2018, I think one of the most important teams at Andela was the HR team. And that was a very strategic function. And so to me, HR is actually one of the greatest assets a company can have when it is a strategic function. So what's your role, right? Well, first of all, you can help identify gaps in the organization. We've talked about these enablers of high performance, or you can call them barriers to high performance as well, right? And so your job is to kind of scope around and understand which of these areas, which of these levers are we not doing so well on. Then support the team to improve in those areas. You identify skill issues, motivation issues, design issues, and then you support with the right initiatives. It might be learning and development. It might be something else. But ultimately, you have to convince the business that you can be of value strategically and be able to show that connection between what you do and improve metrics. So for example, how do you impact employee engagement or employee retention or employee morale or productivity? I think it's a little bit hard to kind of directly impact revenue, right? If you're an HR person, but you can, if you're hiring people on the sales team, you could actually directly impact revenue. So what are the key metrics that really can showcase that you are driving value? And how can you track those key metrics and then begin to do things that get you to move the needle there? Because when you can prove that to a company, trust me, you will get the respect of everybody. So here's a quick checklist you can use. We don't need to go into the detail because this is just us taking everything we've talked about today. And when you go back to the office on Monday, you can ask yourself these questions, right? Go through the 8 different levers and say, for the purpose, is our purpose clear to everyone? Does it inspire people? You can do this by speaking to people around the office to get a sense. You can do this by launching the next company survey. So you can say to your CEO, whoever it is, I think we need to launch a company employee survey and learn more about how our people feel. And I'm going to include these questions in there. And it becomes part of it. Funny enough, one of the tools that we are building at TileStack within our products is going to be this, right? Is basically an employee survey tool that allows you to get a pulse of the company. And then you can, every quarter, kind of rerun the survey and give you a sense for how people are doing along these major areas. So these are checklists that you guys can use when you go back to the office, just to reflect on where you are, and then what are some areas you can identify as areas to focus on to support the company. And so a parting question for you to think about is, what metrics can you objectively say that you impact in your role for the company? All right. I think we've successfully talked about who I am. I've shared my principles around high-performing teams. I've shared a little bit about your role, and now we can quickly take on some questions. And hopefully, as we used to say in debate class when I was younger, I've convinced you and not confused you that you have a big role to play in helping the company you work at to build a high-performing team, and that is not impossible to do. It's very achievable.